All right, so today we are going to deep dive into something pretty massive, the U.S. national debt. We're talking about a figure so big, it's kind of hard to wrap your head around over $35 trillion. Like if you spend $1 million every day, you'd need over 95 years to spend all that cash.
Yeah.
Wild, right?
It is a truly staggering number.
So to help us unpack this, we've got two great sources, the Peter G. Peterson Foundation. They're known for their focus on fiscal responsibility. And we've also got IE Insights, a business school publication with more of a global view. So we're going to kind of weave those two together and figure out not just how big this debt is, but also what it means, what it means for the U.S. economy and maybe even the world.
What?
Ready to jump in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so the Peterson Foundation points out something interesting right off the bat. That $35 trillion figure. It's not just what the government owes to like other countries or investors. It also includes debt that the government owes to itself, like money owed to Social Security. That might sound a little weird. Can you help us understand why that distinction even matters?
Yeah, that's a great question. And it really comes down to understanding the difference between what we call debt held by the public versus intergovernmental debt. So think of it this way. If the government needs money, let's say to build a new highway, they might issue bonds, and those bonds might be bought by investors, say in China. That's debt held by the public. But the government might also need to cover shortfalls, let's say in Social Security. So they basically borrow from the Social Security Trust Fund. That's intergovernmental debt. Now, economists tend to worry more about the debt held by the public because that's the debt that can affect interest rates and sort of have ripple effects throughout the economy. It's kind of like maxing out all your credit cards. It makes it tougher to get loans in the future, and it might even hurt your credit score.
That is a great analogy. And speaking of things that make you want to check your credit score, the Peterson Foundation infographic really drives home the scale of this debt. It shows visually how the U.S. national debt is about the same as the combined economies of China, Germany, Japan, India, and the United Kingdom. That's like owing 5 of the world's economic powerhouses all at once. Kind of makes you wonder, what does this mean for future generations?
It's definitely a valid concern, and even if we don't see some kind of immediate crisis, this level of debt, it really starts to erode trust in the U.S. economy. It's like a company with a ton of debt. Investors get nervous. The IE Insights article points out that this can lead to higher interest rates for the U.S., making it more expensive to borrow money. And it could even weaken the U.S. dollar globally.
Man, that is a scary thought.
Yeah.
And something that both of these sources highlight is the fact that the U.S. has been running these budget deficits for decades now, with very few exceptions. So is that normal? Is running a deficit always a bad thing?
Well, not necessarily. It's important to understand the difference between what economists call cyclical deficits and structural deficits. So cyclical deficits happen when the economy is weak, like during a recession. Tax revenues go down, spending on things like unemployment benefits goes up. It's kind of like if you unexpectedly lose your job, you might have to dip into your savings for a while. But structural deficits are different. They happen even when the economy is doing well. And they suggest that there's this fundamental mismatch between how much the government is spending and how much is actually taking in through taxes. And the fact that the U.S. has been running these deficits for so long, even during some really strong economic times, it suggests that there might be some of these structural issues at play.
Now, this is where it gets really interesting. The IE Insights article really delves into this, talking about how debt, GDP growth, and interest rates, they're all intertwined. They even mention economist Paul Krugman's analogy of the snowball effect, how debt becomes this bigger burden when interest rates are growing faster than the economy. Can you maybe break that down for us a little bit?
Sure. So imagine the national debt is like a snowball rolling down a hill.
Yep.
Now, if the economy is growing faster than the interest rate on that debt, it's like the sun is shining on that snowball, kind of melting it down a little bit. But if that interest rate is higher than economic growth, it's like that snowball is picking up more and more snow as it rolls, getting bigger and harder to manage. And here's the concerning part right now. Interest rates in the U.S. are rising while economic growth is expected to slow down. IE Insights calls this a potential doom loop. Basically, higher interest rates make it more expensive for the government to borrow money, which could lead to even more borrowing to cover those costs. And this could trigger this whole chain reaction. Higher interest rates, stock market instability, a weaker dollar, all of which would have consequences for the global economy.
Sounds like a financial avalanche just waiting to happen. And the Peterson Foundation points out that these rising interest payments, they're becoming like the fastest growing part of the entire U.S. budget. So what does that mean for other government programs? Like if more and more money is going towards just paying interest on the debt, is there less left for other important things?
That's exactly right. If we kind of zoom out and look at the bigger picture, it becomes clear that As those interest payments start to eat up a larger and larger chunk of the budget, there's less money available for other things like education infrastructure projects, healthcare, social safety net programs. And this could lead to some really tough choices down the road, potentially even cuts to programs that a lot of people rely on.
Yeah, it's a tough situation for sure. And the IE Insights article brings up another layer of complexity here. They point out that this is also a political issue. They talk about how some people believe that cutting taxes will help boost the economy, while others think that raising taxes, especially on higher earners, is the way to go. Is there a clear solution that everybody agrees on? Or is this one of those issues where everyone's got a different idea of what the right answer is?
Unfortunately, there's no easy answer, no magic bullet that everybody agrees on when it comes to reducing the national debt. It's this really tangled web of political, economic, and social factors. Addressing it is probably going to require a combination of things, spending cuts in certain areas, maybe some increases in taxes, potentially even reforms to entitlement programs like Social Security. But all of these are really politically challenging, so finding the right balance is going to be key. And it's something that policymakers are going to have to grapple with very carefully.
So it's a complex problem with no easy answers. Not exactly what we wanted to hear, but it is important to understand the reality of the situation. But before we get too bogged down in the doom and gloom here, let's take a moment to explore some of the potential solutions that are being discussed out there. Maybe there's a way out of this mess after all.
Well, it's important to remember that while the situation is serious, it's not hopeless. There are paths forward, but they do require some tough choices and a willingness to compromise.
Okay. That's a bit reassuring. So what are some of those paths? What are some potential solutions that people are talking about to try to tackle this massive debt?
Well, the Peterson Foundation, they lay out a multi-pronged approach, which makes sense given how complex this problem really is. They suggest a combination of things like spending reforms, revenue increases, and policies that actually promote economic growth.
So it's not about just cutting spending or raising taxes. It's about finding the right balance between those things. A&E, making sure the economy is healthy enough to support it all.
Exactly. It's kind of like baking a cake. You need the right proportions of all the ingredients to make it turn out right. On the spending side, the Peterson Foundation highlights this need to control the growth of healthcare costs, which are this major driver of government spending. They suggest things like reforms to Medicare and Medicaid, as well as trying to lower the cost of prescription drugs.
Yeah, healthcare is such a huge part of the budget, and it seems like those costs just keep going up and up. But Medicare and Medicaid, those are really important programs for a lot of people. Is there a way to make those programs more sustainable without having to cut benefits or make it harder for people to access health care?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's one that policymakers are really wrestling with. There are a lot of ideas out there, everything from negotiating lower drug prices to encouraging more preventative care, even just streamlining administrative costs. It's definitely a politically sensitive area. But finding ways to make these programs both more efficient and more sustainable, that's going to be crucial for the long-term health of the budget.
Okay, so that's the spending side of things. What about revenue? The IE Insights article mentioned raising taxes, but that's always a tough sell politically.
Yeah, tax increases are never popular, but they may be a necessary part of the solution. The Peterson Foundation suggests a mix of options here, including things like raising taxes on higher earners, closing those tax loopholes that benefit corporations and wealthy individuals, and potentially even implementing things like a carbon tax or a value-added tax, VAT.
Now, I've heard of a carbon tax, but a VAT, what is that?
A VAT is a type of consumption tax that's added to the price of goods and services at each stage of production. It's actually a pretty common way to raise revenue in a lot of European countries.
So is it kind of like a sales tax, but it's applied multiple times throughout the process of making and selling something?
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. Proponents of a VT argue that it's a more efficient way to raise revenue because it's harder to avoid than income taxes. But critics argue that it can disproportionately impact lower-income households because they tend to spend a larger percentage of their income on goods and services.
Interesting. So it sounds like there are pros and cons to just about every approach here. Is there any kind of agreement on which combination of these things, like spending cuts, tax increases, and other policies would be the most effective for tackling this debt? Or is that still up for debate?
Unfortunately, there's no one-size-fits-all solution, The best approach is likely going to depend on a whole bunch of factors, including things like the state of the economy, the political realities, and even just societal values.
So it's not just about crunching numbers and finding the right formula. It's also about considering the broader impact on people and trying to weigh all these different priorities.
Exactly. It's about making those tough choices, finding compromises. And really having those open and honest conversations about what kind of future we actually want to create.
That's a pretty tall order. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by just the magnitude of this whole problem and wonder if there's anything that individuals can even do to make a difference.
And that's where things get even more interesting. While this problem might seem kind of distant and overwhelming, our individual choices and actions can collectively have a significant impact.
Oh, so you're saying that even though it feels like this big government issue, we shouldn't just sit back and wait for politicians to fix it. So what can everyday people actually do to be a part of the solution?
Absolutely. It starts with being informed and engaged. Educate yourself about where the candidates stand on these fiscal issues, and vote for those who prioritize responsible fiscal policies. But it goes beyond just voting. You can contact your elected officials, advocate for policies you believe in, and participate in those public discussions about the national debt. Let your voice be heard and hold your leaders accountable.
So we can be active citizens, not just passive bystanders.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty empowering. But are there things that we can do in our own lives, like outside of the political realm, that could contribute to a more fiscally responsible future?
Absolutely. You can make informed financial decisions in your own life. This could involve things like saving more, investing wisely, and being mindful of your own personal debt. It's about being responsible stewards of our own resources and setting a good example for others.
It's like that saying, think globally, act locally. We can't control everything that happens in Washington, but we can control our own choices and actions. And those choices, when they're multiplied by millions of people, can actually have a real ripple effect.
Exactly. Remember, the national debt is a shared responsibility. The decisions we make today will have a lasting impact on future generations.
That is a really powerful thought. It's easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and lose sight of that bigger picture. The long-term consequences of our actions.
It's human nature to focus on those immediate concerns, but it's vital to think about the implications of our choices for the future. The economic landscape we leave for our children and grandchildren will be shaped by the decisions we make today.
Speaking of the future, let's talk about some potential scenarios if the U.S. doesn't get this debt under control. What's the worst case scenario here? What could actually happen if we just keep kicking the can down the road?
Well, the IE Insights article, they paint a pretty stark picture of what they call a doom loop scenario. And it starts with those rising interest payments we talked about. As the debt grows, so do those interest payments, which means even less money is available for other priorities. And this can actually lead to slower economic growth, which in turn makes it even harder to pay down the debt.
So it's this vicious cycle. The debt makes it harder for the economy to grow, and a weak economy makes it harder to actually address the debt.
Exactly. And this doom loop, it can have some very real consequences. We could see higher taxes cuts to essential government programs, rising inflation, a weaker dollar, and even just a loss of confidence in the U.S. economy globally.
It sounds like a recipe for economic pain and instability, both here in the U.S. and around the world. But you said earlier that you're optimistic. You believe we can actually find a way out of this. What gives you hope?
Well, I'm optimistic because throughout history, we've seen time and time again that when people are informed, engaged, and determined, they can overcome some seemingly impossible challenges. We have the capacity for innovation, for problem solving, and for coming together to create a better future.
I get that, but it's easy to feel powerless when you're talking about something as massive as this. Can one person's actions really make a difference?
I understand that feeling, but it's important to remember that collective action, it starts with individual choices. Every voice matters. Every effort counts. The first step is acknowledging the problem, understanding the implications, and then engaging in those constructive conversations about solutions.
So awareness is key. We need to talk about this issue, educate ourselves and others, and demand action from our leaders.
Precisely. The future of our country, and indeed the world, depends on our willingness to address this challenge head-on together.
Well, you've certainly given us a lot to think about. It's definitely a complex issue, and it's easy to get lost in all the numbers and the jargon. But what I'm hearing is that it's ultimately about people, about the choices we make and the future we want to build.
That's a great way to put it. The national debt isn't just an economic problem. It's a human problem. And it's a problem that we can solve if we choose to.
Now, that's a message of hope I can get behind. But before we wrap up this deep dive, I want to explore one final question with you. What is the human cost of this massive debt? How does it actually affect the lives of everyday Americans? It's easy to get kind of lost in all this talk about trillions of dollars and economic indicators and stuff. But at the end of the day, it's the human side of this story that really hits home. Both of the sources we've been looking at, they really focus on those economic and political aspects of the national debt. But I'm curious, how does this actually impact the lives of like everyday Americans? What's the real world cost of this massive debt?
That's such an important point, and honestly, it's something that often gets overlooked in these conversations. The national debt isn't just some abstract number on a spreadsheet. It has real-world consequences for families, communities, and individuals across the country.
So it's not just a problem for like politicians and economists to worry about.
Yeah. Exactly. Think about it this way. If the government has to make cuts to important programs like education or healthcare, because a big chunk of the budget is going towards interest payments on the debt, who ends up feeling that pain? It's the students in underfunded schools, the families struggling to afford health care, the seniors who rely on those safety net programs like Social Security and Medicare.
So it's like this ripple effect. The debt might start at the top, but the impact trickles down to everyone.
Precisely. And it's not just about cuts to existing programs either. A high national debt can also limit the government's ability to invest in things that are crucial for the future. Things like renewable energy infrastructure projects, scientific research, job training programs. These are the investments that create opportunities, drive innovation, and build a stronger economy for everyone.
That makes sense. It's like trying to run your household when you're drowning in credit card debt. You're so busy paying off the interest that you can't afford to fix that leaky roof. Or invest in those energy-efficient appliances that could actually save you money in the long run.
That's a great analogy. And just like with the household budget, ignoring the problem only makes it worse over time. The longer we wait to address the national debt, the more difficult and painful those solutions will become.
So what's the takeaway here?
Yeah.
What do you want our listeners to really understand about the very real human cost of this national debt?
I want them to understand that this isn't just an economic issue or a political issue. It's an issue that affects all of us in very real ways. It affects our access to quality healthcare, the state of our education system, the safety of our roads and bridges, our ability to compete in the global economy, and ultimately our overall quality of life.
It's a good reminder that economic policy isn't just about numbers, it's about people. It's about making choices that actually prioritize the well-being of both current and future generations.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground today. We started with this astronomical figure of $35 trillion, and we explored what that actually means, what the potential consequences are, and what some possible solutions might look like.
Right.
We even dove into that often overlooked human side of this issue and how it impacts everyday Americans like you and me. So as we wrap up this deep dive, I'm curious. If you could leave our listeners with one piece of advice, one action they could take to engage with this issue, what would it be?
I would encourage everyone to talk about this issue. Talk about it with your friends, your family, your colleagues, especially your elected officials. Don't let it be the elephant in the room. Have those open and honest conversations about the challenges, the trade-offs, the potential solutions. The more we talk about it, the more likely we are to find some common ground and work together to create a more sustainable future.
That's great advice. Let's not let this be some taboo topic. Let's bring it out into the open, have those tough conversations, and demand better from our leaders. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you found it informative and maybe even a little bit empowering. Remember, knowledge is power, and the more we understand about these complex issues like the national debt, the better equipped we are to make those informed choices and create positive change. Until next time, keep learning, keep questioning, and keep the conversation going.